first of all, I just want to welcome you to our panel tonight about the link between animal use and pandemics. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And we have an incredible panel tonight. Oh my God, incredible. I'm really excited. In fact, I feel a bit guilty taking them away from the world of science and lobbying for this, but we will take their wisdom and we will use it very, very well. So who's saying it's past midnight? It must be somebody in the UK, obviously. I want to begin tonight by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we may be on today. Just to take a moment to acknowledge the original peoples of this land. In Canada, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Let's keep in mind that globally, Indigenous folks need our solidarity to be there to support them when needed and to step back and give them space and amplify their voices when they are speaking or need to be seen. I'd like to take a few moments to introduce, first of all, like I said, just this incredible panel. We're going to start with Dr. Aysha Akhtar, who is the president and CEO of the Center for Contemporary Sciences, which is pioneering the transition to replace the use of animals in experimentation with effective human-based technologies. Amazing. She's a neurologist and a preventative medicine specialist with a background in public health. Previously, she served as Deputy Director of the U.S. Army Traumatic Brain Injury Program and as a commander in the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps, where she frequently deployed to assist with national public health emergencies. Aysha was also a medical officer at the Food and Drug Administration, most recently in the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats, implementing studies on vaccine effectiveness and safety. Aysha, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a great panel.
I just want to pick your brain forever.
I think you'll get bored very quickly.
It might take a little while. All right. And next up, a lovely friend of mine, Melissa Matlow, is the Canadian Campaign Director for World Animal Protection. With a degree in ecology and a master's in environmental studies, she's been leading successful animal welfare and environmental campaigns for 20 years. Oh my God, you're not that old, Melissa. Since 2005, she's worked with World Animal Protection to protect the welfare of animals, wild and domesticated, in Canada and around the world. She advises governments and corporations on developing and implementing animal welfare legislation and policies. Melissa is currently leading a coalition effort to encourage Canada to curb the commercial wildlife trade to prevent cruelty, extinction, and future pandemics. Welcome, Melissa. Hi.
Thanks for having me.
It's so good to have you. It's like, that's how I get to visit with you. Like we
this is it.
Zoom. 'Tis the life of animal rights, activists, right? All right, next up, a familiar face. He was one of our faculty members in week 1, and we love Dr. Tushar Mehta. He practices emergency medicine, but has also spent years practicing family medicine and addictions medicine. Along with a small team, Tushar co-founded plantbaseddata.org, an online database which collects and organizes the most important academic and institutional literature regarding the impact of plant-based diet on health, environment, and food security, including the role of animal agriculture in creating zoonotic pandemics. He lectures on these topics and emphasizes the interconnectedness of human, animal, and environmental well-being. Tushar, welcome back.
Thank you.
And we're so lucky you're on call right now, so you might have to drop out at any time, but we'll hope you can stick with us.
For sure.
Okay, and we have, last but certainly not least, we have Jan Hajek, who is an infectious diseases specialist. Jan worked in Toronto during SARS, in Newfoundland during the H1N1 pandemic, in West Africa during the 2014 Ebola outbreak, and this past year worked on the COVID ward at Vancouver General Hospital, which I believe he's at right now. As well as working in the hospital, he works in downtown Vancouver to provide care for people who are homeless and have a substance use disorder. As an infectious diseases specialist, he has written and spoken out against ag-gag legislation in Ontario and fur farming in BC, and we are so thankful for that, Jan. Welcome.
Thank you.
Am I right? Are you at the Vancouver Hospital right now?
Yes, I am. We're
I
asked to
really
wear,
feel guilty now.
because of COVID, we're asked to wear scrubs. So I'm not a surgeon, but when we're in patient care areas, they've asked us to wear these kind of surgical outfits.
Well, Tushar, are you going to let him upstage you? Go get your scrubs.
Yeah, I'm underdressed. I'm the least dressed up here. We wear scrubs in the Emerge too. By the way, Jan also does some work in developing countries. He works in, which country is it, Jan, that you're having a project?
Uganda. In Uganda.
In Uganda, yeah.
And
I do some
Tushar does
stuff
work
in Haiti.
in Haiti, right?
We have that connection, we have that deep connection to humans at different levels, and I think that really helps us. When we speak to animals, we're also thinking about social justice worldwide.
Yeah, I love that. I love that about our people. All very, very caring people across the board. So let's dig in, folks. First of all, question. Anyone on this panel surprised when the pandemic came along? Yes or no? No, there's some nods. there's some
Not so much, no.
Not so much, yeah. And so, I mean, Aysha, you actually did a TED talk that was incredibly prescient around this, that pretty well outlined what happened. So tell us, let's start with you, Aysha. Why is it that this was not surprising to you?
Well, I'm not the only one by any means. There are a lot of scientists, well, I would say many scientists who've been trying to call attention to the fact that many of our human habits are leading our risk for infectious diseases, and most of them have to do with how we treat other animals, whether it's directly or indirectly. And so, unfortunately, that this alarm has been ignored because it involves animal protection, and most of the world, unfortunately, doesn't care about other animals, don't want to deal with it, and that's definitely the case with our public health agencies. And I would say that they have failed us with this pandemic. They should have known better. We knew it was coming. The signs were there. We had other epidemics that were stemming from our treatment of animals that told us, that predicted this larger pandemic. And unfortunately, this is not the largest pandemic that we're going to experience in our lifetimes. We're likely going to see a much worse one coming out in the not too distant future. So when I was in the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats of the Food and Drug Administration, I worked with multiple health agencies, with the CDC, that's the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institutes of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, Homeland Security, the military, the scientific component of the military, and everyone. And all we did was talk about what drugs and vaccines we might need to stockpile in the case of a pandemic. We never once, not once, did we talk about where these pandemics are coming from and how to prevent them. And that was just such a source of frustration. And again, I just think that, there have been warnings for a long time, and our public health agencies have failed us.
Wow. So just no eye on prevention whatsoever.
That's right.
So, the global health orgs are now reporting that 75% of new human viruses are coming from other animals. Is that a number that we should be concerned with? Is it a number that seems to be going up? And if so, why? Whoever wants to, jump in with this one, I'd love to hear. All very polite.
Tushar, did you want to take this one? Or
Yeah, Jan looks like he's about to speak.
Yeah,
okay.
For it, Jan.
I was about to speak. They're all interesting topics. So I like to talk, so I can't help it. But they're just interesting and very important subjects. I think they're important to talk about. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I was somewhat surprised. I knew pandemics were coming. There's always this low level risk. Always we hear about these things, but this one, just the size of it, I didn't expect. I remember giving a talk about it when I was in Uganda, actually, and thinking, lots of missionaries coming from Italy, and if it would happen, and just the size of it was tremendous. But the fact that one of these is coming, as Aysha was saying, that I think this is it's kind of when, not if, I think was the thing. And frankly, 75%, I think that seems low. I think, of as humans, we've got all our viruses around already. Maybe they're mutating a little bit, so there might develop some antibiotic resistance and things like this. But for the new kind of emerging viruses, I think they're going to be almost all will be animal related and encroaching on other animal environments, like we're seeing with bat related infections, and having our farming encroaching on these environments.
Yeah, I would agree with what Jan said. You know, we're pretty much aware of the human viruses that have been out there and circulating. And like Jan says, there'll be some mutations. There will always be mutations, but we don't know what's out there in the rest of the world in this planet. And that's because historically we have not had such a strong human animal interface in a sense, and that's putting it nicely, like we do today. So we are directly putting ourselves basically in harm's way by the interactions that we have with other animals, whether they're other animals that we have domesticated or other animals that live out in the wild freely.
Kimberly, I have a quick question. I'm sorry, I should have asked this prior to the starting of the talk, but has everybody gone through a module about this already?
No, this is
no. Okay, so this is kind of like a beginning point. Yep. So I think a nice thing to do at the outset is to talk about some of the processes, and I hope people may have watched a prior video about this, whether you've seen Dr. Michael Greger's series about this, Dr. Akhtar's video about it, or a podcast I recently did with plant trainers explaining why this happens. And that is that animals in the wild have a lot of different viruses amongst them. And in most cases, the viruses that live amongst wild animals are kind of biologically mostly stable. They're not like causing a lot of disease or killing off the animals that are in the wild. The viruses that are present, for example, influenza in waterfowl or ducks, right? It's stable. It's a gastrointestinal virus, and it doesn't want to kill off its host, because as these ducks, slowly go from one generation to the next generation, if you wipe out all the ducks, the viruses die as well. So the virus has evolved to be in harmony with those ducks, passing one generation to the next generation. And that's kind of the case for most viruses in nature, right? They're stable with their wild animal populations. They generally don't bother humans, because humans and other animals have limited interactions. And even humans, throughout most of human history, Homo sapien history, are generally kind of isolated from each other. There is interaction, but the population of humans is small, and we're not moving around everywhere as well. And so there's small pockets of humans. Animals are in their environments. There's a little bit of interaction, but they're mostly separate from us. And the viruses that are within those animals are stable within those animals. As we domesticate animals, and as our population increases, and we domesticate larger and larger and larger numbers of animals, we are in situations where we're breeding those animals. And when a virus from the wild is now within this population of animals that we are breeding, we are confining, we are having in very large numbers, congregated, constantly congregated in large numbers over and over again, in ways that mostly don't happen in the wild, right? That's when you have new mutations within those viruses that, if it was a more virulent mutation, and let's say it would kill off a family of ducks in the wild, then the virus would also disappear too. But when we have thousands and thousands of birds, or millions of birds together, generation after generation, virulent mutations actually have a better chance of surviving than the non-virulent mutations, because it can make the chicken really, really sick, let's say, if that flu virus gets into chickens. And that chicken will spew all kinds of virus, infect its neighbors. The chicken may die, but you have lots and lots of neighbors to constantly infect. So you have situations where stable viruses can then have a field day when the bad mutations, which would normally be a dead end in nature, can really mutate amongst these larger amount of animals that we are congregating together, and spread amongst those animals, and have more generation of mutations, and also a bigger advantage for these bad mutations to survive, and also more of an interface with humans, where that they can also have an opportunity to infect humans. And as the human population grows, and as we breed larger in numbers of animals, I mean, there are, factory farms with like hundreds of thousands of animals at the same time. And these wet markets, they're not like little markets. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of animals flowing through them over the course of a year, millions of animals going over a course of a year. So you have like these big warehouses of animals, and let's say there's infection brought in by other birds or bats or something like that, and there's poop and urine, and these animals, getting infected by new things all the time. They're then spreading them amongst themselves. New mutations are generating, and you're doing this over and over again. And then, over time, you will develop dangerous mutations. And the mutations, the danger of mutations is two kinds of dangers. One danger is a virus can be more transmissible, so it can be more spreading amongst animals, but also more spreading amongst humans. It can have human infection capability, ability to spread amongst humans, and then also some danger to humans, like pathogenicity, that it can cause actual severe illness or death. So when you get some of those kinds of mutations, which may be more rare, but you're always generating mutations, that's when we get them as humans, we can have epidemics or pandemics. And as the world population increases of humans, like we're almost 8 billion people now, and as our breeding of animals, which unfortunately has been increasing globally, and we're slaughtering over 80 billion, like get close to between 70 and 80 billion land animals per year, right? So the numbers of animals are just enormous, and that causes increasing chances over the years of getting pandemics. So we had SARS 2002, we have MERS, that's pretty recent. We have HIV within our lifetime coming through this massive bushmeat trade. We have swine flu in 2009. We have this. So you can see, there are things affecting that have come up within our own lifetime. And as Dr. Aysha says, that there's high likelihood of more, as there are so many other viruses that, even things like African swine fever, which currently affects pigs and causes a hemorrhagic fever like Ebola. If there was a mutation that would affect humans, it could be devastating, right? There's other things out there that can mutate and then affect us. And so
that would be another question. And thank you, Tushar, for giving us.
Sorry, I'm speaking so long, but I just thought, because people haven't had a background on this, maybe we should go through some basics.
Excellent. No, perfect. We're all much better equipped now. And so, one of the things I've heard you, Aysha, talk about is just that it could be a lot worse than what we're going through right now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And that was a great overview, Tushar. I'm really glad you gave that. And so sort of jumping on to what Tushar said, if we look at just factory farms, for example, we're really concerned about the influenza virus. That's the virus that we're really especially concerned about. Coronaviruses, by the way, do spread among pigs and chickens. They are different types of coronaviruses that are in factory farms. Whether COVID-19 is in factory farms, who knows? I would not be surprised. And that's even scarier, because then they can mutate, COVID-19 can mutate even further, and we can get even worse variants than we have now. But let's just focus on the influenza virus, for example. And influenza viruses, most people think about the flu and they think, oh, that's no big deal. How's that going to cause a problem? We're not talking about the ones that cause the flu, for which you might get the vaccine every year. We're talking about a type of influenza virus that can truly cause a pandemic. And here we're talking about what's called Influenza Type A. And what's scary about Influenza Type A is that it can be carried by a wide variety of species in addition to humans. So it makes it very hard to track, predict, and contain. And Influenza A all originate from wild aquatic birds like wild ducks and geese. And as Tushar had mentioned, it's pretty stable. The virus is pretty stable in those animals. Those animals don't really become sick from the virus. And we humans very rarely become sick from direct contact with those birds. The influenza virus carried by these birds is not the kind to really cause diseases in us. But this is where factory farms come in, because once an influenza virus gets into a factory farm, it spreads very quickly, very rapidly, passes from animal to animal to animal, like wildfire. And each time the virus passes into another animal, it can mutate into a deadlier form. So this is where what's called a low pathogenic virus can quickly transform into what's called a high pathogenic virus, meaning a very lethal type of virus. And one of the most lethal influenza viruses that ever came out and caused an epidemic was in 1997. And this was the H5N1 influenza virus epidemic. And you guys might have heard about bird flu. This was highly pathogenic avian influenza. And it emerged in China. And then within a year, it spread very quickly throughout the region. Now, the main strain right now of the coronavirus has a death rate of about 2 to 3%, meaning that 2 to 3% of people who get the virus will die from it. Now, that avian influenza from 1997, that is still out there, is still circulating, had a death rate of 60%, meaning 60% of the people who caught that virus died from it. So that just gives you a sort of an indication of how much worse a pandemic can be. And it's very likely because pigs and birds, chickens and turkeys are such, for a better word I can't think of, are such wonderful, great vectors for the virus. I mean, they're perfect breeding grounds for the virus, these factory farms are. We're just seeing mutation after mutation after mutation, sweeping across chicken factory farms, pig factory farms, again and again. And it's just a matter of time before a virus emerges from one of these factory farms that has the right combination to be as lethal as that bird flu of 1997. But unlike that bird flu, which was not very contagious among people, fortunately, a new virus could end up being very contagious and lethal among people. And then we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Yeah,
Oh
I'm
my
sorry,
God.
it's not good news.
No, it's not. And so, you know, now that we are all completely terrified, thank you, Aysha, we need to know this. Melissa, I want to bring you in because my question is, when this information is just so there, it's just irrefutable, why aren't public health institutions, governments, the media reporting and acting on this aspect of pandemics? And you've been talking to tons of politicians in the last few months. What's the sense you're getting? I know Aysha, you know, had a couple of theories. What are you hearing?
So I do think zoonotic disease experts are speaking out about it and have been speaking out about it. The warning signs have been there. Government has been slow to react. We always control and react to problems once they happen. We're never preventative and take a proactive approach. When it comes to farm animals, that's a whole, like our food system is so messed up. It's hard to know where to start at creating a better food system. But when it comes to the wildlife trade, I mean, we've been bringing this issue to the government, and I have to say we are getting a good reception to it. People are, I am hopeful. You have to be hopeful. It does seem overwhelming, but I am hopeful that by the magnitude of this crisis and the way it's impacted the whole world, certainly more people more than others, but that it will motivate people to take action now. If it doesn't, I don't know what would. So I do think this is the moment to be seizing. But infection disease experts have been speaking out about this. So have public health officials, animal welfare scientists, ecologists, environmentalists. Where's the media on this? I have no idea. I don't know why they're not paying attention to it. And in fairness to government, I would say they are so overwhelmed by the current crisis and just getting a grip and control on the pandemic and on the economy that I'm hopeful that the time for us to be advocating for a pandemic prevention strategy is soon after that. But I don't really have an amazing answer other than that.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Like what is inherently keeping, we're hearing about government generally being overwhelmed right now, but I am really curious about the media. Like I come from a media background and I'm like, why is nobody jumping on this story, or very few people? Any thoughts about that?
I'm not an expert on media, but I want to sort of address the previous question I think that you mentioned as well. I think that the media is mostly owned by large corporations, and they're going to sort of sort of promote and explain and talk about the things that are more mainstream and of interest to the people who pay for advertising and, you know, own the channels and things like that. You know, they're not going so far out of the mainstream for the most part. Now, but the other question is about why are people not responding? And I think it's the universal question. Why don't people, we know that there's nearly 1 billion people in the world who don't get enough to eat. Like, why aren't we doing more for that? There's hundreds of millions, maybe, you know, 1 billion children who don't get a proper education wherever they are. Why don't we do anything about that? We're, you know, building weapons. Why don't we do that? There's climate change, or just the, you know, the environmental things that we do aside from animal agriculture. There's very little action on any of those things. So a lot of talk, but very little real action. So it's a universal problem that for so many reasons, some people are comfortable with what they have, people living in their own bubble, people not thinking far enough ahead, people sort of doing their own things that benefit themselves and not thinking about the bigger picture for everybody together. There are other people who are, let's say, don't have the luxury of to even think about these things. They're just trying to cope and survive on their own, depending on where they are and who they are in the world. You get a mix of all these things. And we don't really have a deep teamwork between humans everywhere in the world, and deep thought process. And I think that solving a problem like this requires that same kind of consciousness and thought problem for solving the other problems, which, if you've seen my module, I sort of consider problems of human welfare and human rights and equity and decency, as environmental problems and problems for animals, as really one combined problem. And I think the reasons behind those problems are many commonalities between the reasons of those problems, and humans ourselves have to work together a lot better for everything. And when we have that mentality, when we have that, as we develop a better way of working together for all of you, you know, then we will concurrently hopefully solve these problems. And that also means having compassion for the environment, animals, and for people, you know, just having more general compassion and thought, you know. So maybe, you know, that's from the psychological side. I think it's related to that. And so, and also I encourage people, I guess, not, you know, we're not just animal rights for animal rights, or just for the environment, or just for humans, right? We have to have this combined thinking for everyone together. You know, that's, I think, when we generate the most strength.
Thank you, Tushar. So, as far as can a couple of the real smarty pants here as well talk about again what which viruses have raged out of factory farming environments, and particularly why, again, until this happened, until COVID-19 happened, really there wasn't any awareness that this was coming from farming situations. Can anybody speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, I can take that on. I don't mean to hijack the conversation.
No,
so
not at
Jan,
all.
at any time, feel free to jump in. It's when it comes to factory farms, the virus that it's really, there's one main virus, and that is the Influenza A virus that we're concerned about. And there are other viruses that are circulating among animals as well in factory farms. But the thing about the Influenza A virus is that we share it with other animals. And so humans can carry the influenza virus, pigs can carry the influenza virus, chickens can carry the influenza virus, the Influenza A virus. And that's why it can mutate among these animals and mutate into forms that can infect humans. So if I gave like a scenario of how influenza virus can enter a chicken farm and then rapidly mutate. One thing that many people may not be aware of is that pigs are kind of considered as virus mixing vessels, because they can carry viruses from other pigs, from humans, and chickens. So if you get the influenza virus in pigs, there could be multiple forms of influenza virus. There could be one from humans that are in each pig. They may be carrying an influenza virus from another human, influenza virus from other chickens, influenza virus from other pigs. And so those viruses, in a sense, get together and they swap genetic material. And the situation, and when you get that kind of swap of genetic material, that can lead to what's called an antigenic shift meaning an abrupt change in the genetic component of a virus. And that means that it can become a virus that our immune system does not recognize. It is a new virus in many ways. And so we are not, our immune system is not already primed, has not been exposed to this virus before. We are not primed to battle it. And that's why such a virus can be so lethal and can cause so much harm. So the fact that whenever we have, the more a variety of animals can carry a virus that humans carry, the more opportunities there are for mutations in that virus and mutations into something that can cause a lot of human harm as well as animal harm.
Yeah, and the viruses swap back and forth too. So a lot of times our factory farms and humans, between us, we exchange viruses, but then they can reinfect wild animals and then cause devastation amongst wild animal populations, right? Another sort of basic thing that we have to remember right now is that the biomass of wild animals, wild vertebrate animals on the land in the world is minuscule. We've knocked that population down so low, and humans make up about a third of the mass of global sort of mammals, right? And livestock makes up about 2/3, and wild animals in terms of mammals make up only between 1% and 4% of the actual mass of animals on the earth. Like, so humans have dominated between 96 and 97% of the biomass of mammals and vertebrates, on the earth, and wild animals have been wiped down to quite a small number, and we've turned into these giants. So we are the ones now, our biomass, the combined number of those animals is the generator for more viruses that can also come back and affect wild animals. So wild animals are also threatened by us in so many ways, but also by the viruses we can transfer back to them. And the other thing is that you'll hear all the time is that, humans are invading nature, and because we're causing deforestation and all these problems and causing climate change, that's why we're getting pandemics. And that's true, because what happens is that our populations are expanding over the land and interfacing with wild animal populations more and more, as opposed to like once upon a time when we were in our little pockets and wild animals mostly roamed everywhere, and we sort of stayed in our places, had less interaction and exposure to wild animals en masse. Now we've spread everywhere, so our livestock operations are everywhere, and they can be infected by a bird that gets in there or a bat that gets in there or other ways and catch wild animal viruses that then introduce new viruses and spread and cause problems, in addition to the existing viruses that are already there amongst our livestock, like influenza A. Now, one thing you should also be aware of, that many people don't ever like to look at the aspect of animal agriculture. So when you hear them talk about this in the media, they'll only talk about the climate change and the fact that we're causing deforestation and spreading amongst the earth. But they'll exclude the sort of part where our livestock and our animals in our bushmeat and live animal trades, et cetera, become a biogenerator for the viruses that also transmit to us. But it's really a combination of all these factors, right? We shouldn't forget that there's an environmental insult by spreading through nature. We should not let people who only want to look at the environmental negativities that we're doing, but there's a lot of people interested in the environment, but they never want to think about animal agriculture. We shouldn't let that be forgotten, that animal agriculture is indeed a big part of it. So that's in terms of the mechanism and just the overall picture of our biomass. That helps us keep these things in perspective and understand them better.
I'm not going to be not as nice and diplomatic as Tushar when he tried to give reasons, which I loved your comment, Tushar, about why the world isn't really addressing this issue. And I'm going to give my own take. Is it comes down to so much of what we're seeing is coming down to ultimately how we decide to treat animals. And unfortunately, to really tackle this issue, we each have to ask ourselves, how culpable are we in the problem? And very few people are willing to do that. And that includes folks in the media. They eat animals. Most of them eat animals. Most of the world eats animals. Most of the public health specialists, most of the people in the public health agencies, they eat animals, they support experimenting on animals. They don't care. They just don't care about how we treat animals. And until we fundamentally take a look at how we treat animals, we are never going to solve this immense problem, whether we're talking about infectious disease problems, climate change. And climate change, as Tushar was talking about, is a result largely, not solely, but largely a result of factory farming and the livestock industry, environmental destruction, which again comes back to factory farming and the wildlife trade, not solely those issues, but significantly due to those issues, as well as many of the issues that tie into how we treat animals, how we treat each other, and how we want to think about the planet as a whole. But unfortunately, most people just aren't willing to take that look, really to turn the mirror onto themselves.
Yeah, which applies to, you're right. It applies to the environmental crisis. It applies to so many areas. And it's just such a wall still that we've got to find some way to break down. And I want to talk about strategies in just a second around that. But Melissa, hearing the blocks that there are around people, making the connections around factory farming, is that one of the reasons why your group, World Animal Protection, decided to seize this time to make the case for protecting animals, to protect public health via the wildlife trade? So that tell us a little bit about the campaign that you are working on.
And first of all, just to say, I 100% agree that all these issues are so interconnected: climate change, our food system, and the wildlife trade. And all our habits. For us, we always grapple with how do we, obviously transformative change is needed, but how do we design an incremental pathway to get there for government? How do we find actionable ideas that MPs can take forward? And for anyone who's feeling quite depressed right now, I just want to turn it back to the fact that we have more animal-friendly MPs elected in the House of Commons than we've ever had before. We see how many people are on this call? 244 animal advocates on this call late at night wanting to learn more how to make a difference. We're seeing plant-based protein in grocery stores, restaurants like we've never seen before. Canada's Food Guide advocating for eat less meat. So there is change that's happening, and I do think there is a segment of more influential people that care about this as well, and we just need to find our champions. We did decide to focus on the wildlife trade because we thought it would be easier, but also because of COVID-19. Scientists are still trying to, investigate the evolution of this virus, but the World Health Organization has said that this wildlife market has played either an amplifying role or could be the origins of this pandemic. And we know the government is just focused on COVID-19 right now. So we see a great opportunity to ask Canada to curb the commercial wildlife trade, because when you talk about bringing different animals that are not accustomed to being in proximity with other animals, they wouldn't normally encounter each other in the wild, kept in stressful, crowded conditions, it's the perfect ideal environment for deadly diseases to fester, to spread like wildfire and impact us all. And Canada is a big part of that trade. This isn't just a problem that originated in China. We facilitate that trade. Consumer demand here creates a zoonotic disease risk elsewhere that can impact us all. So we do see less opposition to this issue. And we also see that Canada is importing so many wild animals for such frivolous reasons. Millions of animals are coming in, 80% for the exotic pet trade. So when we're talking about unnatural interactions with animals, and we're plucking animals out of the wild just to keep as a pet to brag about, we're seeing, a US organization found that bat paperweights were being imported into the US for the goth industry. Like, these are the most frivolous items, and they not only are obviously cruel, but it's playing a role in the biodiversity crisis, and it's clearly dangerous as well. So we do feel we have an opportunity there to try to get some action on the wildlife trade. And that's not to say that we shouldn't tackle farming too, but we're going to need all of your help to do that.
Yeah, and Melissa, how has the reaction been with you lobbying right now? Because I know from animal justice's point of view, it's been really hard to get, say, media to cover anything that's not COVID related. So is that like this sound, and it's hard to get any government to look at anything that isn't COVID related. So this is one of those opportunities where we can still do some work for animals is through the pandemic and what it means to how the link between animal protection and human protection.
Yeah, and I think this is a great opportunity to meet with MPs because MPs are more accessible through Zoom. Previously, we would have to take a trip on the train to Ottawa and organize lobby days, and an MP's schedule could change like that, and you're going there for nothing or for a few meetings. This time, you can really try to get a meeting with an MP and hopefully make yourself available at the spur of a moment. So I do find that certain meetings and opportunities are more accessible to us. We've been invited to UN forums on the Convention on Biodiversity that I never would have been able to. As a charity, that's really hard to be able to afford those trips or be at them all. And with online, you really could flip to another meeting. You just, you don't even move out of your chair. So in some ways, politicians are accessible. And I think looking for who we can influence the most. Do you have a good relationship with your MP? Is your MP the critic for agriculture, environment, health? This is an issue we've just talked about. It touches on everything. So frame the issue based on their critic role. Look at what other bills they've passed, what's important to them, what does their constituency care about? And also, probably most important tip is to treat them like a human being. They all have kids at school, animals that are going to bark in the meeting. They might have a loved one in a long-term care facility. And they really are at the front lines as well. They don't get that credit enough. I think we all like to just, throw things at our MPs, but they are struggling with a lot in maintaining that role and advocacy for us. So I would encourage people to do that.
Thank you, Melissa. And I want to talk a little bit more about messaging in just a second. But, I want to get Jan in here because we've been talking a lot about viruses, and I know this gets off the pandemic or the COVID topic a little bit, but can we touch on bacterial infections for a minute and talk about the public health implications of rampant antibiotic use in factory farms? Does that have any effect on future pandemics?
Well, future pandemics, these are they're very complicated, all these issues, viruses, bacteria, wildlife and factory farms and things, but they're all important issues. And I do think, I'll just say that COVID has brought this to light. I think COVID has really kind of put an issue on the fact that this virus could be from bats, may have come through an intermediate animal, maybe even through mink farms, and how we're all related together. I think that's for messaging, that's important. I think also messaging antibiotics, people care about that. I think that it's very important to us, and there are direct links with antibiotic use on farms and resistance in those animals, and then humans getting antibiotic resistance bacteria. And so those links are there. And I think that in general, animal industry, and these are known, that the risks of, as Aysha was saying, the influenza, that we know we're watching for the next pandemic. There was recently a influenza, a case found in Alberta, swine flu in a person. And it was not a big surprise. It's like, yeah, we know this. We know that viruses and bacteria on these farms can switch over into humans and make us sick. The difference is, it seems like we know about this, but we're just accepting that. We're saying, well, what to do about it? It's there. We're going to try to monitor, but people aren't really talking about, let's stop it. These are unnecessary risks. If there's some risks that we have to take, okay. But if there's some unnecessary risks that are giving us this risk for pandemic and disease, we should stop those. So just for the antibiotics, say, for example, there was a drug called ceftiofur, which was used for preventing umbilical cord infections in chickens in Quebec. And because they gave it to all these eggs or young chickens, this antibiotic that's also used for humans. And then when humans started getting sick in the area, they noticed that they were carrying that same antibiotic resistant bacteria, the salmonella that was resistant to ceftiofur, that was also used in those chicken farms. Then they reduced it. They stopped using that ceftiofur in those chickens, and they found that in humans, that antibiotic resistant bacteria also decreased. And part of the problem is that animal agriculture has been somewhat protected, or it's changing a little bit, and it still needs to change. But there was an own use policy where a farmer in Canada could apply for any antibiotic overseas based on the kind of a good price and use it on their farms without informing anybody in Health Canada. And then by exposing that, and by saying, look, it's an industry, but it's not just business, it has public health implications. I think that helped, that at least there's a bit more oversight on antibiotic use on farms. Recently in China, they were using a drug called colistin, which is it's one of our reserve antibiotics. If someone comes sick here to the ICU and our standard antibiotics aren't working, one of our reserve ones, which we very rarely use, is this drug called colistin. And they were using it in mass pig farms. And by the bacteria gets on the pig, it goes into the human population for pig farmers or for consumers of the pig's flesh, it can lead to bacterial infections amongst them. And some of those bacterial infections will become resistant to antibiotics.
Aysha, I can tell you want to get in there.
If I can just add on to that, to what Jan was saying, I mean, it's most people don't think about antibiotic resistance until you get an infection, when and you find out that your doctor is trying to find one antibiotic after another that's going to fight your infection, and that's when it really hits home. So just one thing to clarify, in case people aren't aware, antibiotics are for bacteria, not for viruses. So when we're talking about pandemics, we're really talking mostly about viruses, because they can spread very easily and they can mutate much more rapidly than bacteria. However, antibiotic resistance can compound the problem that happens with a pandemic. So if you get hit with the coronavirus, for example, or any virus, what often happens is people get what's called superimposed bacterial infections. And Jan, I think you can speak especially about this, but so it's not the virus itself that may kill you or may cause significant harm. It can sometimes be the bacterial infection that come in after the virus, because your body's already hit, your immune system is already working on overtime to fight against a virus. It has a hard time fighting any bacteria that may come in. This is what has often happened with people with HIV. It's not the HIV, that virus itself that may cause death or the significant diseases, but the bacterial infection that come in because these people are already sick with HIV. And so in those cases, we need these antibiotics. We need these antibiotics to combat these superimposed bacterial infections. And that's where the problem really can hit hard. And I just want to let everyone know, I don't know if you're all aware of a new documentary that's going to be coming out sometime this spring. It's by a BAFTA award-winning director. His name is Alex Lockwood. It's produced by Keegan Coon. You might know him from Cowspiracy. And executive producers are Joaquin Phoenix and Rooney Mara. But this is the only documentary that's going to be coming out that's really going to take a look at animal agriculture and the issues that we're discussing now, and how this pandemic started and how the next pandemic may come out from animal agriculture. So do keep an eye out for that film. It's called The End of Medicine. That refers to the end of antibiotics in a sense. And it, as far as when and where, we don't know, but it'll likely come out on a mainstream streaming service, something like Netflix or Discovery Plus.
Excellent. If one of our moderators could put that in the chat, just so that we have it. Can you repeat it again, the name, Aysha?
Yeah, the title's called The End of Medicine, or End of Medicine. I don't remember if there's a D or not, but it's Alex
Simri's
Lockwood.
Already got it.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Great.
The End of Medicine. Okay, excellent.
Maybe I'd just like to clarify that antibiotic resistant thing. So we have bacteria on us, and these bacteria on us can give us infections, like urinary tract infections or abdominal infections, and we rely on antibiotics to treat those infections, penicillin, ciprofloxacin, and other ones. In farms as well, and overuse of those, as the bacteria get exposed to these antibiotics, they develop a resistance to it, and then we have to use a different antibiotic. And the more a particular bacteria gets exposed to one antibiotic, the more the risk of that bacteria having a resistance. On farms, especially the high industrial factory farms where they have intensive farming, to maximize their profits, they were feeding a low dose of antibiotic to all the animals. And by exposing lots of these bacteria to these antibiotics, they developed drug-resistant bacteria. And then those drug-resistant bacteria on those farms amongst those animals could spread to humans as well, colonizing us on our skin and on us as normal bacteria. But when we get sick with those bacteria from a urinary tract infection or abdominal infection, then some of those antibiotics will not be able to protect us.
So, and I don't know if I was just going to give some Canadian stats. I don't know if that, I don't know if our panelists have other updated information, but we looked at this issue, our organization, and found that in Canada, 78% of all antibiotics are administered to food animals. I don't know if there's any updated information since then. 90 countries prohibit antibiotics for growth promotion, and 6 prohibit antibiotics for prevention of disease. Canada allows it all. Industry is making some efforts in that area, but this is clearly an important call for government to do more in Canada.
Yeah, I think that even those numbers, when they say 80% of antibiotics, I think in the States, it's also like that 80% of antibiotics used are used for farmed animals, causing the problems that Jan and Aysha mentioned. But I also wonder if that's an underestimate sometimes. Like, I wonder how much they track the industrial production of these antibiotics, which then go everywhere, because just the sheer mass and volume of animals getting these antibiotics at a constant low dose level, the numbers could add up to a lot more. And, we just don't know always the accuracy of those things and how well it's tracked. So maybe it's even a lot more.
So I want to open it up to questions in just a sec. So these are the instructions around questions, folks. We're going to ask you to put, when you have a specific question and not just part of the chat, to put ****Q and then your question, just so that we can delineate it from the rest of the chat. So let's, if you put the question earlier, put it again. Let's just, because I promised we weren't taking questions till 8. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I do have something that I'd like to pose to any of you or all of you, and that is we've got 250 people here right now on this meeting. Hundreds more will be watching it. We have 5,000 people in all in this academy, and the people are ripe to do stuff, and especially we're hearing that really the only kind of stuff that is getting any traction right now is around the pandemic, or around pandemics. And so what is some of the messaging that you think it's really important for our people to hang on to get out there, in terms of persuading their family members, persuading their MP, persuading, if they're doing a social media graphic? I'd love to hear from each of you, which little tidbits do you think are most sort of captivating? What would be some of the most powerful things to be able to, if they were to remember like 3 things, what would it be to be able to impart? And I know that can be a little bit of a tough question, but I'd love to see if you have anything. Aysha, do you have anything? Oh, sorry, Tushar, you got something?
Yeah, I'll let Tushar go first.
Yeah.
It's a harder question to answer.
I think there's more than one part to this question. I think, what I like to tell people is that, listen, when we're breeding millions and billions of animals, we are concurrently breeding and spreading and transmitting and mutating different kind of viruses. You're breeding animals, you're breeding viruses, and some of those animals are going to bite us in the ass. You know what I mean? Like it's literally like that. So So that's kind of a simplistic way of putting it. People have to have that in their head. Like Melissa's saying, we advocate that to the politicians, but I think a great deal of public education needs to really be done as well, because people aren't going to really accept changes from government, and government won't consider changes unless they find them acceptable to the public. So the public has to feel this and know this, right? So that's, that short kind of bullet points that you can give to people. But the other thing that we need to do is sort of learn more about it ourselves. And I guess there's probably going to be a module about this. And there's some good resources that we should learn about this really important subject, so that then we can communicate it better. And Dr. Aysha's video is one of the first things that really made me think about this, her TED Talk. She's got a book. Dr. Gregor's book and his video series is also really fantastic. And that's a great thing to absorb and share these resources. I've done a podcast, and I shared in the notes here as well, the notes for the podcast with the links to relevant articles along the way to sort of step-by-step overview this topic. That's another resource. Pick one of those resources. You're probably not going to have time for everything unless some people are very interested, but at least pick one of those resources and go through. And then let's start educating the public as much as we can, as well as politicians, let's say, when you have that opportunity. And, but people this has to become general knowledge. And we have to work at making this general knowledge so that people know that, breeding animals or having large mass animal agriculture is especially breeding viruses. This is a problem for us, right? And even more than just for us, but that's maybe a bullet point. And then also have resources to share Aysha's book or podcast, Dr. Gregor's, my thing, whatever, share a resource that you feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, Debbie in the chat is saying there's too much info needed to share in an elevator speech. Maybe carry cards with links so people can check it out later. So yeah, having your sort of go-to links, digitally or whatever, can be a really important thing. And I also just want to mention that there's an initiative that one of our AJA members, Mo Markham, has around this called Eating Animals Causes Pandemics.com. You can't say it any clearer than that. Eating Animals Causes Pandemics.com. It's in the chat. You might want to check it out. There's a Canadian petition, and then there is also a regular petition. And speaking of petitions, we also have going on in the chat the petition that World Animal Protection has going on, which is a government e-petition calling on the Canadian government to curb the commercial wildlife trade to prevent pandemics. And they also have the ability to be able to send an email or a tweet directly to your MP from their website. So Kaylee, if you can put that in the chat, that would be amazing. Before we move up into some of the questions, does anybody else have anything they want to add about messaging, about maybe some of the things that you've sort of seen really catch people, really make people think, that one, little piece that kind of really seems to cut through for people? Is there anything in particular that comes to mind for you folks?
That's a hard one about the specific messaging. I think it's, as Tushar said, there's so many good resources. I've distilled some information on some quick, easily to digest blog posts as well. So if you just look up my name, you'll go to my website and there'll be blog posts, older blog posts, but they're still relevant as well about the messaging of how we're getting these infectious diseases. One tactic, though, if you don't mind, if I kind of switch a little bit, is
Love it.
I know we all feel, and I don't mean to be, I don't mean to have been such a downer.
No, you got to tell it like it is, Aysha. That's what we have you here for.
We all feel very frustrated and very helpless often because, we put people in power, and whether they control the media, whether they are our representatives, whether they're public health agencies or so on. And yet so many of them, not all of them, but so many of them end up disappointing us. But I would say that one thing each one of us can do, and we've seen this more and more, when you see articles in I don't know what the newspapers are, the big newspapers in Canada are, or the big, you just think of the big ones in the US, like the Washington Post, New York Times, and so on, Boston Times, and so on. when you see any article that deals with a pandemic in any way, talks about animals, talks about factory farming, animal agriculture in any way, we can all just flood the comment sections, and bring up these key points. It's one thing we can all do, because readers really do read these comments. They really do. And so that's one way of educating, and that's something we can each do. Is I would say, let's just make it our goal this year to flood the comments whenever there's any article that touches in any way on the issues that we discussed today.
I think following that up, we hear people in the news talking about the pandemic all the time, right? We hear news and people talking about, of course, everywhere you go, people talking about this. People very rarely talk about the cause and the root cause. And that's a problem with everything. Nobody wants to talk about the root causes of problems. So it's good to bring that up. One great way is what Aysha just mentioned, comment on that. And then I'm just going to add one thing is when you comment on it, put in a link. Put in Aysha's talk, put in her blog post, put in her Dr. Gregor's or mine or something like that. And that people then have a resource to go to that provides references. Because most of the time, pretty much all the time, when we say something, we should provide a resource that gives or makes available the scientific references that sort of prove the point and hammer home the point. So it's not just a debate of words. We're providing a good link with resources. And I think that's when we're communicating with friends and everywhere we go, provide a link that shows the evidence, the scientific evidence for this. And yeah, that's it. That's a good practice.
These are really helpful. And our week 5 is all about getting more savvy with using media. And so we have a whole module around writing letters to the editor. We're going to talk more about writing opinion pieces, but we can't underestimate the power of every citizen being able to get their viewpoint in a major newspaper by writing a pithy letter to the editor. So I love that. Okay, I want to go to questions here. Bob asks, which is more problematic in terms of generating another pandemic, factory farms or live markets? And I'm just going to throw that out there. Whoever feels that they want to speak to that, all ears.
We can't say which is more problematic. The problem with the live markets, or which is just one end result of the wildlife trade, is that you're bringing together many different species. So species which may normally not interact with each other or interact with each other much. So and the conditions and the suffering and the distress and the ill health and everything that these animals are experiencing in the wildlife trade makes it very easy for virus to jump from species to species to species and then on to humans, which is what we suspect happened in this case with the coronavirus. But then we were talking about factory farms as being another perfect breeding ground for infectious diseases. It's really, really hard to say. Unfortunately, there's a good chance that we'll see 2 pandemics come out next. I mean, who knows? One from the wildlife trade, one from factory farming. They're both equally risky, I would say.
And remember also that these wildlife markets and things like that in bush, in bush meat trade in the African continent and other places, it doesn't sound like a lot of animals. It sounds like small. It sounds like a wildlife market. It doesn't sound big. These are big operations. There's millions and millions and millions of animals flowing through. Sometimes just one market can have that amount of volume, and the combination of these things in the African bushmeat trade, which through which Ebola has happened, and also HIV has come to humans through that as well. It's not a small thing. It's involving millions and millions of animals, and also a lot of human exposure with the bushmeat trade and wild animal markets. That is also more human exposures going on there. And HIV didn't just transmit from one type of monkey into humans once. It was probably a recurrent event where different simian immunodeficiency viruses transmitted into humans, many times over many years. And over time, we got some more dangerous variants that got into us and caused this terrible HIV pandemic that has hurt so many people, killed so many people, so many lost lives, just devastating. and there's certain viruses that may be more transmissible and through the bushmeat, and then others may be preferentially more through factory farms as well. Not to forget also the smaller animal operations, animal breeding operations throughout the world. So there's a recent paper that came out. I have it in the notes of my resource that I shared. That even backyard farming, even though it's smaller in numbers, you have lots of more exposure to outside animals through backyard farmings, and people do transmit between farms to farms and farms, and it is not posing the same risk necessarily as factory farms, but that also generates some risk. And let's say, farming of cattle in places like India and other places, like, you may have smaller operations, but they may eventually generate a new version of something like smallpox, because there's cowpox and different pox viruses that exist in them, and a new variation could give us a repeat of that really terrible virus. So, just the total numbers of animals farmed throughout the world is so huge, and now we're seeing mink farms and all that stuff. And an interesting thing is that, as Aysha alluded to, that even our factory farms, pigs and chickens carry different forms of coronavirus, and we had all these factory farm workers getting infected over and over again, right, throughout the world. There is the possibility that farmed animals were also transmitting this to workers, but we don't know, because I haven't heard of any real testing that was done comprehensively, amongst factory farmed animals to see if they were also transmitting just the way mink are doing it too, right? So there's a lot of questions that nobody explored it. I don't think there was a will to explore it. I don't think animal agriculture industry wanted us to explore that question, but I'm surprised that people haven't brought that up more. Yeah.
I'd just like to say I agree with those comments. I think that it's the volume too. It's a very good question. Live animal markets, I think about it sometimes too, that it's hard to generalize these things, but the volume, for sure, there's risks with lots of these things: backyard farms, live animal markets, going into hunting and factory farming. One example, so sometimes I like specific issues. It's hard, it's easier for me to focus on and then I think about specific diseases, and say there's one interesting story about Nipah virus. I think Tushar alluded to Hendra viruses. So in Malaysia in the late 1990s, pig farms were growing in size and in areas, and they encroached onto some forests, and in those forests there were fruit bats. And these fruit bats were carrying Hendra virus amongst them, similar how coronavirus is carried amongst bats, and not causing much problems to the world amongst those fruit bats. But then somehow the fruit bat associated virus, this Nipah virus, got onto the pig farm. It might have been the fruit bats dropped some fruit onto the farm, and then the pigs got sick. And so that's the kind of deforestation or encroaching onto the wilderness. Then this big pig farm worked as a kind of amplifier area where more and more pigs started getting into it. Instead of just one pig, one fruit bat, it was a big industry of pigs that were now spreading this respiratory virus amongst themselves. And then humans came into the picture for farming these pigs, and they got sick. And they were about, there's a respiratory illness, but it caused encephalitis. About 50% of people who were infected died. And to deal with that outbreak, they killed about 1 million pigs. And it's an idea. It just shows us how this all kind of works together a little bit. We're going into nature, encroaching onto animal territories, and then amplifying it on a pig farm, and then spreading to humans.
And for me, Kimberly, it's the industrialization of the wildlife trade and farming that's really caused, I think, scientists to say we're going into a pandemic era, because there's disease risks everywhere, and we have experienced epidemics and major disease outbreaks for quite some time. But are we not escalating it to such a degree that it's very scary? It's very alarming. Like we're shipping mass volumes of animals all around the world for different products, where intensive agriculture is growing. We're encroaching on habitats at an alarming rate. And so it's no surprise that we're seeing a big pandemic right now, so close to SARS. The frequency seems to be changing.
So Melissa, when you're talking to the politicians that you're lobbying, do you see anything in particular that you say, like, is there like just a boom sort of slam dunk with what you say to them that they just, there's a light bulb that goes off?
I think, the disease percentage, that statistic that 75% of new and emerging infectious diseases originate from animals, principally from wildlife, that it's a relationship with animals that's at the root of it. To me, that's the message I like to tell the story. If people have, I don't know if there's anyone that can say they haven't been impacted by this crisis. And I can't imagine anyone saying that they'd want to experience another one soon. So starting with that point, that the toll of this pandemic on the economy, on health, on lives is so great that people have to be compelled to put every ounce of energy into preventing the next one. And if we're serious about that, we have to address all these issues in a holistic way. We've started with the commercial wildlife trade just because of its direct link to COVID-19, but certainly it's an opportunity to talk about our farming system as well.
And I think you can also emphasize when you're communicating with politicians or other people that the next pandemic, you could have some virus that has a 50 or 60% mortality, right? Like something devastating that spreads amongst humans. Okay, that could happen. I think the chance is less of something like that happening. It's not that it's impossible, but it's less because those types of viruses which kill off the host very, very quickly tend to have and work very fast. People tend to separate away from them very, very fast. They kill off their host population very fast. They tend to be less transmissible, maybe locally transmissible, but then, like we've seen things like the Ebola viruses and stuff like that. They're devastating, but they haven't hit like millions of people, right? But there's it could happen, but there's a very good chance that you have something like the current situation. But let's say it's twice as transmissible and having equal amount of mortality. Imagine the paranoia and the increased amount of death that would happen just by doubling the transmission and having the same amount of mortality, twice the number of people getting infected. You can have a situation where it maybe has the same amount of spread, but double the mortality. So that would also be much worse than the current situation. You could have both, twice as transmissible and twice the mortality. We're worrying about some of the variants coming out. We're seeing what happens with them. Then you'd have 4 times the mortality. You may have, something like, 5 times the mortality, 10 times the mortality. Those numbers could occur. And if you just had something that was 5 times as bad as the current pandemic, which is within the conceivable realm of this type of a virus, you'd see a lot more horrible, impact on society worldwide. You could get 2 times, 4 times, 10 times the mortality, and that's within the realm of possibilities right now. Like the mortality is like between whatever 1% and 2%. Let's say you had about a 5% mortality rate. That would scare the bejesus out of people. And if it was very transmissible, that would be like horrendous. So this is within the realm of possibilities. And as Melissa says, it seems to be increasing in frequency because the human population, just in our own lifetime, in my own lifetime, the human population has doubled. And the number of farmed animals that people use have doubled as well, right? So think about all those factors and that mass of people and animals that's generating and transmitting viruses. That's our amount of travel of animals being transported and humans transporting themselves around, that's also exponentially gone up. So, these are all combined factors that we have to know about. There was another question I thought was interesting, if I may. This one about the philosophical question, just what if, somebody was saying, what if, humans got wiped out and then it would be better for the earth, right? I just wanted to address that because I think it's actually kind of an important question. And people often think about it very simplistically. I think that, number one, if humans got wiped out, it wouldn't be a good thing. I love humans, right? That's why I'm a doctor. That's why the rest of us are doctors. And it's a negative way of thinking. I think it's not a good way of thinking, like, why don't we just get rid of humans? I'm mad at humans, right? I think we want to get out of that way of thinking to one that actually does appreciate human existence. And that's, because there's a lot of beauty and a lot of good things to appreciate about humans. There's also a lot of bad things, but it's through that appreciation that we will reach other people and that we will change other people's hearts and minds, because we see ourselves in them and they can see themselves in us, when we connect in that way. And that's going to be necessary because these are not separate questions. Compassion to humans, animals, and the environment are not separate issues. And when people think about like, what if we just wiped out all the humans, we're separating these issues that are actually a one thing. And we want to show if we want other people to have compassion to animals, let's say, then we have to show that we are uniting these aspects of compassion ourselves and inspiring something within that other person to see that compassion as one thing for all, right? And I think that's important. The other thing, just biologically, humans are freaking tough. Okay.
Yeah.
I've been in places where I've worked in India and Haiti and traveled to other places where humans survive the most horrendous conditions. And there's something biological about humans that when shit gets real, when the situation is bad, right? When there's war, when there's poverty, when there's, terrible situations, people have more babies. Okay. They're just in survival biological mode, and they're not thinking about, like, what do I want to send my kid to this university? I should just have one kid, plan it out at this age. It's not what happens anymore. So when there's wars and strife, you have instability amongst humans. You may diminish the population temporarily, but it doesn't take long for that human population to bounce back and exceed whatever it might have been before. What we really need for people to smarten up and live better and not do these things is we need stability amongst humans. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have to live the lives that we do in developed countries where we're over consuming everything. Okay, we in developed countries need to consume a lot less than we do. But we, in the world, people here also need stability of education, healthcare, human rights, safety, and just all the other things that make life sort of good without necessarily over consuming so much. And it is stability that will lead us to sort of a gradually sort of lower birth rates, consuming less, smaller footprints, greater thought process about, appreciation for nature, animals, each other, all that stuff. That is the type of society you would need to be able to do this. If we just think that like war or famine or disease is going to wipe humans out, guess again, we will fight and claw our way, and we will cut down the last tree and shoot the last elephant if you need to feed yourself. So instability is not the thing that you need to solve these problems. It's actually stability. And hopefully we can work towards that.
Well, somebody said, sorry, go ahead, Aysha.
No, I was going to say, adding on to what Tushar so eloquently said, I've seen a lot of posts and information, a lot of misinformation, a lot of hatred and anger. And I understand where the anger and, comes from. But at the same time, I've seen posts that say things like, well, if we vegans aren't, for example, are immune to the virus, which is completely wrong. That there's this misinformation that because we are vegan, that, yes, we may be healthier in general as a population, and that's a may be healthier in general as a population, but it doesn't mean that we are immune to the virus by any means. And that's misinformation. Then I see things like, who cares? It's all the non-vegans who are going to die and get sick from the virus. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen posts like that and texts like that and tweets like that. And that is so wrong. And that is not, first of all, if you didn't care, it's getting back to what Tushar is saying, that's so fundamentally wrong. That kind of thinking is the kind of thinking that puts us here in the first place. When we start separating groups, when we start saying it's us versus them, humans versus animals, vegans versus non-vegans, and so on, blacks versus whites. And, so many of the problems that we face are because of that us versus them mentality. I personally have a lot of family members who are nowhere near vegan. They're not vegetarian. They eat animals, relatives, and I don't want to see them get sick. And, I wish they weren't. I wish they would stop eating animals, but it doesn't mean I want them to get sick. And so we have to be really not misrepresent the science and our own health risks for illnesses. Because yes, vegans are we're prone to catching the virus too. We can get very sick from the virus. We can die from the virus. And then second is to stop perpetuating that us versus them mentality in any form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like you can't solve a problem by creating more of the same problem. You have to look at what do we want this world to look like, and how do we start acting like that right now in the way that we speak and share information and collaborate. I mean, we've got to inspire the world to, get together and care about all beings. So I love that. I love that we have all these science nerds who got all philosophical here. That's really nice.
Another thing I just want to bring up, because we don't have much time, I'm sorry. A related comment, the thing that you always hear is sort of this idea, and I think the word is doomism, right? That people say, oh, the world's going to hell anyway, so who cares? There's nothing we can do, and we're just depressed about it, or screw it, I'm going to do whatever I want and not think about it or whatever. There's that end of the spectrum. There's another end of the spectrum where people have this over optimism. Well, the system is going to find some solution and it's all going to fix itself. Or we have technological optimism where we think, oh, some technology will come up and solve everything. Developing all these technologies. And I don't think that's true either. For every technology that solves a problem, there's like 100 technologies that make the problem worse by just consuming everything, right? And there's a lot of misuse of technology. Technology can be good, but you have to use it properly, right? And that's an issue. So I don't believe in the over-optimistic view. I also don't believe in the overly negative view, like there's no hope. But there's an in-between view where we know there's a lot of bad things going on. There's a lot of potential for things to be worse, and there's also potential for things to be better. And so what we do matters, right? And so it's, and I think that's very realistic. What we do matters. We may not individually be able to completely make the difference or pull the levers. It's going to require a lot of teamwork. But I just don't like the, overly unrealistic optimism or the unrealistic, doomism or whatever you want to call it. But, that when people present either of those views, I think it's nice to bring people back to the middle where, we have a lot of choices ahead of us and a lot of work to be done. And what we do is going to sway the course of what happens to humans and all other life on the planet.
All right, folks, we are coming up to 8:30, and I think we could probably, like I said, go all night. We have some brilliant minds here. Thank you so much for bringing in fact, I was pretty intimidated to do this panel with all of you PhDs and masters and everything. But what I did tonight is I put on my jeans instead of my pajama pants, just to be a little bit smarter. So I hope you appreciated that effort.
Thanks for dressing up.
Kimberly, you're brilliant, though. A lot of brilliant people in the audience.
I'm going to take you all off of Spotlight right now, just so that we can see everybody and they can give their appreciation to you. I really apologize to folks that we weren't able to get to that many questions, but we just had so many wonderful sort of discussions happening organically that I think were really valuable. So, I'm hoping that maybe even some of our panelists might join us in the Facebook group tomorrow, and maybe they'll be willing to answer some questions. I know, Jan, you're in the Facebook group, so anybody that's wanting to do that, we can, and see if can be some other questions. Of course, that is not required at all of our panelists. They already gave us so much of their really valuable time. So now, folks, that we have everybody out on video, and we still are 225 strong, can we please thank our panelists, Aysha, Tushar, Melissa, and Jan. Let's give them a big hand. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you so much.